4 years, 1,462 days. No call on my birthday in August. No text when I retired after 31 years at the plant. Not a single word when the dog I'd had since my son was 17 passed away, and I buried him alone in the backyard on a cold October night with nothing but a flashlight and a broken heart. I'd made my peace with that silence. Told myself it was just how things were now, that some doors close slowly and you don't always hear the click until years later. Then my son's name lit up my phone on a Wednesday morning in March, and every wall I'd spent 4 years building came down in about the time it takes to read a text message. I didn't recognize the number at first. He'd changed it at some point in the last 4 years, which told me more than I wanted to know, but I recognized the words. You don't forget how your own kid writes. Dad, saw the Columbus Business First article about you. We should reconnect. Felix is hosting a dinner Sunday at his place in Dublin. Come at 6. And bring a certified check for $75,000. There's a limited partnership opportunity you need to hear about before it closes. Don't miss out. I set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter and read it again. Then a third time. Not, I've been thinking about you. Not, I'm sorry it's been so long. Not even a question mark at the end. Just a number with a dollar sign in front of it, sitting there like a cover charge to get back into my own son's life. Welcome to Dad's Real Revenge. Pull up a chair. What I'm about to tell you took 4 years of silence, 3 days of research, and one Sunday evening at a glass dining room table to fully understand. Stay with me. You're going to want to hear how this ends. Part of me wanted to put the phone down and go back to my breakfast. The smarter part of me, the part that spent 3 decades in aerospace quality control, tracking microscopic stress fractures in aluminum alloys, knew that when something surprises you that much, you don't react immediately. You observe. You collect data. You figure out what's actually happening before you make a move. So I didn't respond that morning. I let it sit. I walked through my house instead. The same house where I raised him after Marlene and I split up 12 years ago. The driveway, where I taught him to back a car out without clipping the mailbox. The kitchen where he used to eat cereal at the counter before school while I made his lunch. The garage where we spent an entire summer rebuilding a '68 Mustang engine, neither of us knowing what we were doing, both of us pretending we did. I stopped in the hallway and looked at the school photos on the wall. Kindergarten through 12th grade. He had my jaw in Marlene's eyes. In most of them, he's grinning like he knows a joke nobody else is in on. I stood there long enough that the furnace kicked on and startled me back to the present. 4 years is a long time. Long enough that I almost didn't remember the exact moment it ended. But I do. He'd been spending more time with Marlene and her new circle of friends, people who had opinions about everything and especially about me. My son stood in my driveway, 27 years old, telling me I'd never supported his potential, and that Marlene had opened his eyes to all the ways I'd held him back. That I was transactional, that I saw everything in life as a cost-benefit analysis and couldn't just love people without conditions. I'd said, "That's not true, son. I love you without any conditions. That's why I'm standing here asking you to talk to me." He'd said I was proving his point by trying to argue, and he'd gotten in his car and left. Marlene had spent 6 years after the divorce feeding him a version of me that I barely recognized. Not in big dramatic speeches, she was too smart for that. Just small drops, consistent and patient. Your father's not generous. Your father thinks in spreadsheets. Your father's love comes with price tags. Eventually the drops fill up the bucket, and all at once a kid looks at you through someone else's eyes and doesn't like what he sees. I understood it. I didn't accept it, but I understood it. I sat down at my desk Thursday afternoon and looked up the article he'd mentioned. Columbus Business First had run a piece on retiring engineers from the aerospace sector, pension shifts, patent licensing income, how some of us were faring better than people expected. I was quoted in 3 sentences. They mentioned my name, they mentioned that I'd licensed 2 patents to a defense contractor, and that I had significant financial flexibility in retirement, which was their polite way of saying I wasn't hurting. I closed the browser, opened a different one. I looked up Felix Carano. I told myself I was just curious, the way any father would be curious about who his son was spending time with. That's what I told myself. But 31 years of finding problems in components before those components go into aircraft that carry human beings made me thorough by habit. You don't learn to look for hairline fractures in metal and then turn that skill off when you walk out of the building. Felix Carano had a website for something called Carano Capital Partners. Professional designs, stock photos of city skylines, testimonials from people I couldn't verify actually existed. His photo showed a man in his mid-30s, dark hair, sharp suit, the kind of smile you practice in front of a mirror until it looks natural. I pulled up Ohio court records. It took me about 20 minutes to find the first civil complaint, a couple in Westerville who'd invested $40,000 in a guaranteed commercial real estate fund that stopped returning calls after 6 months. The case was marked settled, sealed. I kept going, old habit. By Friday evening, I had 6 more complaints filed with the Ohio Division of Securities, 2 active civil suits from investors in Franklin County, a Better Business Bureau file with an F rating, and 3 pages of unresolved complaints, and a set of LLC registrations that listed addresses which turned out to be UPS store mailboxes in Worthington and Upper Arlington. Then I found the one that made me put my reading glasses down and just sit for a moment. A corporate filing from 3 weeks prior showing that the primary operating account for Carano Capital Partners was subject to a federal asset freeze, pending investigation. I printed everything, 41 pages, put it in a manila folder, same kind I'd used for 30 years to keep maintenance reports at the plant. That Saturday night, I sat at my kitchen table with that folder in front of me and I thought about my son, not who he'd become, but who he'd been. The kid who used to fall asleep on the couch watching college football and wake up asking who won. The one who cried for 3 days when his grandfather died and tried to hide it because he thought that's what men were supposed to do. I'd told him then that crying over someone you love isn't weakness. It means you paid attention while they were here. I'd like to think some part of him still remembered that conversation. I wasn't sure anymore. By Sunday afternoon, I was dressed and in my car heading toward Dublin, the folder on the passenger seat, and no certainty at all about what I was driving into. Felix Carano's house was in one of those newer developments off Rings Road, kind of neighborhood where every house looks identical, but the landscaping tries to convince you otherwise. It was a big house, too big for what a man with a legitimate small investment firm should have been able to afford. But that thought I kept to myself as I rang the doorbell. My son answered. He looked good on the surface, filled out since I'd last seen him, dressed sharply, a nice watch on his wrist that I didn't remember him owning. He looked at me the way you look at a contractor who's shown up to give an estimate. Functional. Assessing. Dad, he stepped back, you came. I said I would, I told him. Inside, the house was all open floor plan and recessed lighting, and the particular kind of interior design that announces money without quite managing warmth. There were 2 other couples already seated in the living room, wine glasses in hand. An investor dinner, I understood then. I was one of several prospects at the table. Felix came in from the kitchen. Up close, he was younger than his photos, maybe 34, with the particular kind of energy that reads as confidence until you learn to distinguish it from performance. He shook my hand with both of his and called me by my first name like we'd known each other for years. We've heard so much about you, he said. Your son is incredibly proud of what you accomplished. Lockheed, right? 30+ years? 31, I said. Good memory. Numbers are kind of my thing, he said, and winked. We moved to the dining room for dinner. Catered, nice food, the kind of meal that costs enough to make the ask seem smaller by comparison. Felix spent most of it talking about his portfolio, dropping addresses of commercial properties in Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, occupancy rates, cap rates, annualized returns that any halfway informed person should have been suspicious of. My son sat next to me. He laughed at Felix's jokes. He nodded along at the numbers. Once, when I asked a question about whether the fund was registered with the SEC, a simple question, the kind any reasonable investor should ask, Felix smoothly redirected to something about proprietary structure that protects investor confidentiality. And my son gave me a look across the table that I remembered from when he was 15, and I'd asked too many questions at a parent-teacher conference. After dinner, Felix produced a folder of his own, a partnership agreement, clean and professional looking, $75,000 minimum buy-in for a Class B limited partnership stake, with promised quarterly distributions and an annual return of 14 to 18%. That's the floor for new partners, Felix said, sliding the folder toward me. Given your background, given what Dawson's told me about your situation, honestly, you'd probably want to come in at the 150,000 a tier. That's where the real upside lives. I looked at the folder, then I looked at my son. Dawson, I said, I'd like a few minutes with you, just us. Is there somewhere we can step away? Felix didn't move. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms in a way that was almost casual, almost relaxed, but not quite either. Anything you want to say, you can say here. We're all partners at this table. I kept my eyes on my son. Please, 5 minutes. My son glanced at Felix. Then he looked back at me with an expression I recognized from the driveway 4 years ago. The look of a man who has already decided, who is only waiting for you to finish so he can confirm it. Dad, he said quietly, whatever this is, just say it. Felix is my partner. I'm not going to ask him to leave his own dining room. I sat with that for a moment. The other couples were very still, pretending not to listen. Okay, I said. I reached down and picked up the manila folder from the chair beside me where I'd kept it out of sight under the table edge. I set it in the center of the table between the wine glasses and Felix's glossy partnership documents. Everything in there is public record, I said. 7 civil complaints with the Ohio Division of Securities, 2 active lawsuits from investors in Franklin County, a Better Business Bureau F rating with more than 60 unresolved complaints, LLC registrations that list mailbox stores as business addresses. I paused. And a corporate filing from 3 weeks ago showing that the primary operating account for Carano Capital Partners is subject to an asset freeze, pending a federal investigation. The table went very quiet. One of the other couples, the husband, slowly reached over and picked up the folder. He opened it. His wife leaned in to read alongside him. My son was staring at me. Not with anger yet, with something more unsettling than anger. With the look of a man who has just realized he may have been standing in the wrong place for a very long time. Dad, he started. I drove here tonight, I said, keeping my voice level, because you asked me to, and because after 4 years of nothing, I let myself hope that you actually wanted to see me. Not the article, not the retirement account. Me, I looked at him directly. I spent 3 days looking into the man you're building your future around. I needed you to see what I found. Felix was talking now, smoothly and quickly, explaining that the complaints were from disgruntled investors who didn't understand the timeline, that the BBB rating was being actively disputed, that the federal matter was a misunderstanding his attorneys were already resolving. His voice had a practiced, reassuring quality that probably worked very well in most rooms. It wasn't working in this one anymore. I could see it in the way the other husband held the folder and didn't set it down. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket the same way I used to button it before walking into a flight certification meeting where I had to tell a room full of engineers that their component had failed inspection and we were starting over. I'm not signing anything, I said. I'm not transferring a single dollar. And I want you to know, son, that I didn't come here to embarrass you or to be right. I held his eyes across that glass table. I came because I still believe you're the kid who cried for 3 days when your grandfather died and tried to hide it because you thought that's what men do. And I didn't want that kid to lose everything to a man who was already planning his exit. I left the folder on the table and walked out. The drive home was quiet, no radio. The March air was cold and the highway was mostly empty and dark. I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't second guess what I'd done, because in 31 years of quality control I'd learned that you can't unfile a report once you've filed it. You write it because it's true. What people choose to do with the information after that is not yours to carry. I got home at 9:15. I made tea I didn't particularly want and sat in my armchair by the window and waited, because I already understood that something was coming and I wanted to be steady when it arrived. The next 2 days were the loudest silence I'd ever lived through. Monday I mowed the back section of my yard even though it didn't need it, raked leaves that weren't bothering anyone, called my sister in Indiana and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. She didn't ask why I was calling in the middle of a workday, and I was grateful for that. Tuesday I went to my regular checkup, got my blood pressure taken, higher than usual, no surprise there, picked up groceries on the way back and made myself eat a real dinner instead of standing over the sink with crackers like I'd been doing most evenings. Tuesday night I was half watching the local news on low volume when the anchor's tone shifted. I'd watched her for years and I knew that particular change, the small lift in her voice when a story has real weight behind it. Breaking tonight from the Polaris area, federal agents from the FBI's Columbus field office have arrested a local investment firm operator on charges of wire fraud, securities fraud, and theft from investors across central Ohio. Authorities say the suspect operated what they describe as a Ponzi-style scheme that defrauded dozens of investors of more than $2 million over a 3-year period. The arrest took place this afternoon during an investor presentation luncheon at a hotel on Polaris Parkway. They cut to footage, a conference room, round tables with white centerpieces, glasses of water still on the tables, people in business dress standing very still along the walls the way people stand when the world has suddenly changed size on them, a man being guided through a side door by 2 agents in dark jackets. Felix Carano. His suit still looked expensive. His face looked like a man who had been expecting this day for longer than anyone else in that room. I put the newspaper down slowly, the way you set something down when you want to make sure it doesn't make a sound. The camera panned across the room and I saw other faces. Some I didn't recognize, one I did. My son was standing near the back, close to the draped windows, a glass of water in his hand that he clearly had no idea what to do with. The camera only caught him for 2, maybe 3 seconds. But in those seconds, he looked exactly the way he had when he was 8 years old and watched a car accident happen 30 feet in front of us on Broad Street. Like the world had just shown him a version of itself he hadn't known existed and couldn't unsee. I turned off the television, sat in the dark living room for a long time. I didn't feel satisfied. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to say I felt vindicated that justice had arrived on schedule and I could close the book. I didn't feel any of it. I felt tired in a way that sleep doesn't touch. I felt the specific sadness of watching someone you love have to learn something the hard way when you tried with everything you had to show them another way first and they turned away from you. I made myself a cup of coffee I didn't need and I sat and waited because I already knew what was coming next and I wanted to be ready when it got here. The knock came Wednesday evening. Not a polite knock, not the knock of someone who is confident about how they'll be received. It was fast and uneven. The knock of someone whose hands are shaking and who is pressing hard to make sure you hear it through the door. I walked to the front of the house, stopped with my hand on the knob for just a moment, took a breath, then opened it. My son was standing on my porch in the same clothes he'd been wearing in the news footage. He hadn't shaved. His eyes were red in the particular way that comes not from crying once, but from not being able to stop. The collar of his jacket was turned up against the March cold, and there was something about his posture, shoulders dropped, weight shifted slightly back, that I recognized from when he was very small, and had done something he already knew was wrong before he said a word about it. "Dad," he said. His voice cracked on that single syllable. "I need to talk to you." I stepped outside instead of stepping back to let him in. I pulled the door mostly closed behind me, and we stood there on the porch under the light, just the two of us in the cold. "I know," I said. "I didn't know what he was doing," he said quickly. "I swear to you I didn't know. I thought he was legitimate. I thought I'd finally found something real." He stopped. Pressed his mouth closed for a moment. "I put in 40,000 of my own money, Dad. Everything I'd saved since I got out of school." "I know," I said again, and I kept my voice even and quiet. "You didn't know. But you also didn't let me show you what I'd found. I asked you for 5 minutes alone, and you told me that Felix's comfort in his own dining room mattered more than whatever I needed to say to you." I paused. "I'm not telling you that to punish you. I'm telling you because I need you to understand what it felt like, coming from my son after 4 years." He looked down at the porch floor. He stood that way long enough that a car passed on the street, and its headlights swept across the yard and faded. "She told me you were controlling," he said. "That you always had to be right. That your way of loving people was making them feel like they could never measure up. I know what she told you." I believed her. "I know that too." He exhaled. It sounded like something he'd been carrying a long distance and had finally set down. "Why didn't you fight harder? When I stopped calling, why didn't you push?" "Because you weren't a child anymore," I said, "and because every time I tried, I could hear in your voice that you'd already decided, and pushing harder was only going to confirm what she'd told you about me." I looked at him steadily. Sometimes the only thing you can do for someone you love is stay where they know how to find you and wait until they're ready to come back. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, stood there with his eyes blinking against what was building behind them. "What do I do now?" he said. "The FBI wants to talk to me. Attorneys are saying I may need to cooperate formally. I lost everything in that fund. I had plans, Dad. There was someone I was going to ask to marry me this summer, and now I don't even." He stopped, let out a breath that wasn't quite steady. "I don't know where I am right now." I let that sit between us for a moment before I answered. I needed him to actually hear what was coming next, not just wait for it to be over. "I'll help you find a good attorney," I said. "I'll cover the retainer. Not because you're entitled to it and not because it cancels out 4 years, but because you're my son, and I'm not going to watch you drown in something that wasn't entirely your fault when I have the means to throw you a line." I paused. "But Dawson, the shortcuts, the idea that a man like Felix was going to hand you the life you wanted without you having to build it yourself, that has to be finished, not as punishment, because that thinking is exactly what led you here." He was nodding, not the quick nod of someone agreeing to end an uncomfortable conversation, the slow, considered nod of someone who is actually taking something in. "I want to come inside," he said quietly. "I know," I said, "and my door will be open to you, but not tonight. Not because I'm angry with you, I'm not." I looked at him in the porch light, This person I had known longer than I had known anyone else alive. Because I think tonight you need to sit with this on your own. And when you're ready to come back as my son, not because you need something, not because the floor has fallen out, I want that to be a decision you've made with a clear head and a full heart. Do you understand the difference? He looked at me for a long moment. Something behind his eyes shifted, not softened exactly, but settled, like something that had been slightly out of alignment had finally seated the way it was supposed to. Yeah, he said, I do. I put my hand on his shoulder, briefly the way I used to when he was young and had gotten through something hard. Then I went back inside and closed the door, softly, the same way you close a door on a room that still matters to you. I stood in the hallway for a minute with one hand flat against the wood, listening to his footsteps on the porch steps, his car door, the engine turning over, the street going quiet. The house settled back into itself, the furnace ticked on, the kitchen clock kept its count. I went and poured the last of the coffee down the drain, rinsed the pot, put it back in its place, turned off most of the lights, sat down in the armchair by the window. Outside the street was empty. The porch light made a small, steady circle on the front walk. Beyond that, just dark. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. Winning had never been what this was about. I hadn't driven to Dublin Sunday evening to expose Felix Carano, even though that's what happened. I'd gone there to show my son what I'd found and ask him to look at it with me, the way I used to ask him to look at an engine part and tell me what he saw wrong with it. He hadn't been ready that night. He was closer to ready now. Whether he'd actually make it through that door, that part wasn't up to me. All I could do was what I'd always done. Stay where he knew how to find me, keep the light on, and trust that somewhere underneath everything he'd been told about who I was and everything Felix had taken from him and everything the last 4 years had cost us both, my son still remembered the way home. I turned the porch light off at 11 and went to bed. Some things you leave in the dark and see what comes back with the morning. If this story hit close to home, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button while you're at it, and make sure you're subscribed. The next one is already coming, and I promise you won't want to miss it.